now is your chance, really, to let's go into this with real problems that people have here. There's such an extraordinary variety of people here that I've just had so many interesting conversations. How do I apply this to warfare or climate change or all the other responsibilities people here have? So we've got 25 minutes. Let's really range over the issues that people have, including, successes. Tell us where you've managed to do something that you find convincing, as well as things where you don't quite know what to do. So these are questions to these two. Who's going to start? Is there somebody with a mic anywhere here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine Renfrew from...
Could you stand up?
Got my wine glass in my hand. I'm Catherine Renfrew from DCMS. I'm just more of a kind of comment, really, on your earlier presentations. You use happiness and well-being interchangeably, and I wondered if you could just talk about that for a minute, because I don't agree that they're the same thing.
Should I take that one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, we do use happiness and life satisfaction and well-being interchangeably. And there are clear differences between them. Particularly well-being has meant very many different things to lots of other groups of people, right? Well-being is a more fuzzy concept, basically. But the difference between life satisfaction and happiness is relatively small. So if you ask people how happy are they with their life as a whole, the correlations between that and life satisfaction would be almost 0.8, 0.9, be very high, be almost exactly the same concept that one is measuring. So those two, the differences are, from any analysis, small enough to ignore. So when we talk about well-being, we're talking about this broad perspective that we want to measure what is important to people in their own lives, how they feel about it, and the best measure we have of that as a single measure for us would be life satisfaction. But we're a broad group of scholars, and even on that one we might not all agree, but we do agree that well-being is sort of the point, and then there's the question, how do you measure that best? But this notion of what is important to you in your life and how do you experience it, that's what we're after.
Thank you. This is Mark Spivak from HM Revenue and Customs. I have a question about the symmetry of well-being. Kind of started with, here are a few factors that affect your well-being, and one example that jumped out at me was doubling someone's income. Yes, you can tell I work for the tax authority. Doubling someone's income has a certain effect on their well-being. Are we that confident that all of these effects are symmetrical, such as in that case, halving someone's income would have the equal and opposite effect?
Well, some light is thrown on that by the different regressions we've done with different ways of breaking down the income distribution. So I mentioned the one where you break down misery and you break down income into above and below the 20th percentile. And you get very similar effects of these different things on these different things from what you get if both of them are treated in a continuous way. So I think we shouldn't be too hung up on that issue, though we should always check on it, of course.
Maybe I can answer a bit extra. There have been many studies would look at the difference between giving you £100,000 and taking away £100,000 on you.
Oh,
and the rule of thumb on that is that taking away is roughly twice as bad for you as giving it to you, right? So this is this reference position thing. But the functional relationship, for instance, between life satisfaction and income is the same whether you're poor or whether you're rich. But the functional relationship just means that a dollar buys you an awful lot more when you're poor than when you're rich. Right? It's both. It's a logarithmic everywhere you look, as it were.
Thanks very much. Ashley Gray, Loughborough University. You've noted in a few of the presentations time increments of 1 to 2 years measurement of well-being. I just wondered, at a more acute level, can you over-measure well-being? So if we're looking at a daily basis?
I'm not sure. Well, I mean, I think firstly to say that, I mean, for many interventions that will be talked about, have been talked about, could be evaluated, the effects could be very volatile volatile, over short periods of time. So I think you need to be careful to be able to measure those changes if they occur. But measurement itself is interfering in the lives of individuals and is interfering with the measure itself. So I think it's getting that balance right. The danger is that you measure something at such a long time point after the intervention, you completely lose the effects and maybe you're completely washed out by that point. So, I mean, I was in a discussion yesterday about bullying. I think bullying has an effect over 40 years from adolescence. There's evidence on that. But there's a new study out which says the effects on depression and anxiety wash out after 3 years. So, I think that we need to be cognizant of potential long-term benefits and long-term consequences and measuring them sensitively, but also measuring some of the short-term effects so we don't miss out on that little blip in terms of improvement. I'm not sure if that's quite answering your question, but Paul set me up for that. So.
All right.
I mean, I can say that you get very different results whether or not, depending on the time frame you ask. So if you ask people, are you happy at this moment, you're going to get quite different correlates than if you say, how happy are you with life as a whole? And because we're interested in this overall variation, we're interested in life as a whole. But there's a real difference there, and it gets you different policy answers.
Next question. I think we would really love to hear examples of things that people are doing successfully or with difficulty. Yes, please.
Actually, I'm going to ask for an example rather than provide an example. Thank you. Federico from the Department for Education. So basically, at the moment, we tend to appraise policies based on value for money and pounds. And basically, we are suggesting to move a bit more towards an appraisal based on well-being alongside value for money, or one day maybe replacing value for money. I was wondering whether you had any examples, maybe one each, of policies that are currently in place that would not be in place if we had looked more into well-being, or policies that are not in place and you think would be in place if the economic appraisal of these policies would have included well-being when that was the time.
I've got an old example. So we did an evaluation of the closure of long-stay hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, mental handicap as they're called, hospitals and so on, and looked at people before they were leaving hospital, looked at them afterwards, and in fact for some of them followed them for 12 years. And what we found, particularly for people with intellectual disabilities, was that the care in the community was more expensive than the hospital, on average. For lots of people it was cheaper, but on average it was more expensive. That in terms of their clinical characteristics, their behaviour, their intellectual disability, no change whatsoever. In terms of their social networks, actually they were smaller in the community than they were in hospital. But in terms of their self-reported well-being, we used the Cantrell ladder. This is going back 30 years, I think. We used that. It was much, much better. So I think well-being in that case was, I mean, we didn't say that was the pivotal measure, but I think it did show that when people have an opportunity to express their views with support about how the life change has affected them, that's quite important. And that change was greater over time for that group than it was even after a year. So that's why I think well-being was really quite helpful in giving us a different perspective on what had happened.
Yeah,
okay. So I would have several examples in mind, but the main one that comes to my mind is this whole increase in the attention to mental health for kids at school. There's been this whole wave of interest in mindfulness, grit, resilience, and in various countries these things are now rolled out to whole populations. So Macedonia had a whole population intervention on what is known as grit. And I think that those things would not have been possible if the notion that the internal life, the psychology of people wasn't important, had become mainstream. And so we now have mainstreamed the idea that what really matters is how we feel about things. And we can now talk about this in a way that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. I mean, it would have been totally unthinkable. And so I think, particularly from an outside perspective, when I joined the LSE crew 9 months ago, I was amazed how openly Brits were talking about their feelings. This is not the Brits I knew when I grew up. And so there's been a real sea change in this country, and I think that is basically the same movement. Now, if I think more widely, not just about academia and policy, about the impact of all this satisfaction stuff, that is enormous in every walk of life. I mean, in universities, it's now very normal to base promotions on how well your students think you are teaching. That is now totally normal. Conferences are evaluated by what you say, how satisfied you are after the conference. So we have an incentive for you to say that this was great, right? Reciprocity. But people choose their restaurants in this way. People choose the trustworthiness of people they trade with on eBay in this way. This has now become a totally normalized part of our society to base scarce choices, scarcity-based choices, on subjective well-being measures.
I'm Emily Hutchison from the Care Quality Commission. Martin, earlier you mentioned some reservations about social return on investment. I was wondering if you could expand on that point.
I knew somebody would do that. I should have kept my mouth shut. But I think there's quite a big movement from SROI, and I think the good things about it are I think that people who do SROI are trying very hard to monetize things that haven't previously been monetized in terms of benefits.
Martin, probably some people here don't know. Maybe even I'm not sure.
Okay, so social return on investment is it's a method which SROI people would say is not cost-benefit analysis, although I disagree on that. I think it's cost-benefit analysis in that conventional monetizing benefit sense. And what they're trying to do is to put monetary value on more benefits than has been possible before. And I think they're doing that in a way which is trying to involve people who use services in a way which is serious and very much to be applauded. So that's really good. There's a report published by the Cabinet Office about 3 years ago on SROI, and when I look at that, I see some really good things. When I look at the areas I know in terms of mental health, I was unimpressed by how they had tried to monetize some of the benefits. And the other thing I would say is that I think that if there are SROI enthusiasts here, my apologies for this, but I sometimes think that the SRI community spends so much time trying to distance itself from cost-benefit analysis that it fails to recognise how well cost-benefit analysis, and particularly in the health field, how well that has addressed some of the issues they're trying to tackle. So I think a bit more learning across. And I will just tell you one more thing, which is for bad reasons I inherited a research project because of all sorts of issues which I can't talk about. And it's got social return on investment as part of it. So I've had to sort of learn to then bring it into the long-term care area, and I can see lots of positives, but I do have those hesitations I mentioned.
But since this is an important question, I mean, I understand QALYs, which is that you value the health state as people who have never been ill say they would value it. And this was a method invented by economists at York, and remarkably it's been accepted. But hopefully at some later stage we'll move on from that to valuing health states by how the people who actually experiencing them evaluate them. But it's to do with how people, it's a measure of it's a non-monetary measure of outcome per unit of money spent. That's the criterion. Now, what's the criterion in the SROI? Where does the health? How does the health state enter into that?
No, well, it's not. I would say that the SROI studies that I'm familiar with, and the descriptions of the approach, I think, have failed to engage with what's happened in health economics evaluation. I think the QALY has its limitations, and we can come back to talk about it separately, but I think that the approach that health economists have taken, which is thinking about the trade-offs between the gains in outcome and the higher costs of achieving them, getting to that sort of cost-effectiveness plane, bringing in that threshold value, looking at that sort of discussion, I think that is a way to try to engage decision makers in this difficult situation. And I think what's being proposed here for doing that with well-being is exactly parallel to what's happened with the quality in health, exactly. But it's broader. And I think what the SROI people are saying is that they're, in a sense, they're comparing what they do with what I would see as sort of Green Book economic evaluation 25 years ago, if you like. Monetize everything you can rather than being aware that it's not possible to do everything. So I think that's the difficulty, I think.
Thanks.
Just one quick on the quality thing, just quickly to say, I think the difficulty, the argument that health economists have about using the general public's valuation of different health states in order to get to the utility scale is that resource allocation is a societal responsibility. Now, they may be wrong on that, but that's the reason why they've gone with that particular.
No, I understand it. I understand it. Yeah. Thanks. Richard, please.
Hello, Laura Burgoyne from HMRC. How would you deal with a situation when a policy has been implemented which has so the cost benefits are positive, but the well-being is coming at a cost? So there's a negative impact on the well-being, even though there's a cost benefit and those decisions are already in motion.
So you're talking about an irreversible program which it costs something and it destroys happiness. So stop it.
It saved money, net.
Yeah, it's saving money.
Well, so this was exactly in Martin's quadrant. He showed things like that, and then the same type of criterion applies, because the money saved can be used to buy happiness elsewhere. So the question is, if this costs only a little bit of happiness, but I'm saving a lot of money, fine. But it depends on that ratio. Right?
I think the political difficulty often is, in the health space at least, the political difficulty is that people don't want to see patients getting a particular treatment, then getting a worse treatment. But that's only, as Paul said, only half of the story, because the saving, if it's substantial particularly, can then be reinvested, and it could actually mean that more people get treatment, not quite to the same standard, or those same people get the supplementary treatment to improve their health or improve their well-being. So I think the trade-off is more, it introduces interesting ethical issues as well as practical, technical issues. So.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Roberts from the Department for Education. I was wondering, we've been talking about happiness and well-being in terms of what people say makes them happy, what they think they want. But government also has levers to change what people think they want. And I wonder what you think that means in terms of policy making.
I'll give an answer.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Yes, I've never really seen it as a problem that governments change what people want. I mean, this is official policy in the area of education to make people into good citizens. And that has, for hundreds of years been recognized as an attempt to change what people might otherwise have learned at home or how they would naturally be. And so, for me, I see no problem philosophically or ethically with trying to change what people want. I just want to judge it on the final outcome. This has helped them to be happier individuals who are also good to other people. Do we get a better society that way? And if that society, hence, looks somewhat different from what today's society looks, great, fine. So I see no problem in trying to change people. I mean, people influence each other all the time and try to influence each other, and government is just a player in that.
I want to ask a question, largely directed at Nancy, but also at everybody here. I mean, what strikes me is that just talking to the random selection of people I've spoken to, it really is extraordinary how deep these questions are that are being asked. Someone here asked me, how do we evaluate war and peace? Well, it's researchable. We know what happens to happiness in countries where war breaks out. But I think nobody's done it. I've never seen it done. It's just amazing how stimulating it is to have these meetings. You think, well, blindingly obvious questions. Nobody has ever ever looked at. Somebody raised the issue of how do we think about climate change in terms of well-being. Well, many of us have thought about it in terms of the discount rate, but we probably haven't thought about it much further than that. And we should do, because it makes a lot more sense to think what it means for India to have a lot of people on the move in terms of the impact on well-being than the impact on the Indian GDP, which is how it's been discussed in the Stern Report and elsewhere. So there's just this huge agenda here, and I'm just thinking, Nancy, there's a lot of talented people here with inquisitive minds. You don't want to commit yourself, and nobody will, but is there some way in which we can build up and build on this community that we've already got here in this room and the next door room to somehow continue this and have people, writing papers, but even speculative papers on the different topics in their area? I think it would provoke, it could give a huge boost to research, because my impression is that a lot now of research on well-being, as on every subject in the world, is getting to where you build on the previous research rather than you take on the new problem. And we want to break out from that. I mean, I don't know if I can ask for a vote, but suppose we had a monthly seminar, let's say, where people, maybe from this audience and maybe from outside, that's a tricky issue to make sure you get the right people, but where we had one after another people tackling an issue like warfare or climate change or other issues, rather not probably mainly in health and social care, because they've been worked over, but in other areas, domestic violence or whatever. If we had such a seminar, who here would like to come? Who here would like to give a paper? Yeah, well, I don't take that answer. proper shyness and discretion. I take it that thing. Well, I think that's quite interesting.
I think she wants to ask you.
Yeah, do you want to comment on this?
As an extension of that, to what extent do you think values and national values affect the perception of trade-offs? And, even if it's more expensive to do something, you can sense that it would have the perception that it's deeply engraved in people's values and therefore would affect well-being in the end, individuals.
I mean, a very quick response to that would be, this is obviously a discussion that's happened a lot in the health space with NICE, and so NICE historically have not been hesitant to recommending interventions which will add higher cost to the NHS bill, because the health gains and in some cases the well-being gains as measured would be substantial. But the realisation now is that NICE are in this difficult position now where they can't keep recommending things because the NHS doesn't have the resources to deliver them. So I think that is around a sort of national debate about how much we then value those health gains. And I think the advantage of going with a well-being approach to evaluation is you then have that opportunity to look at how those well-being gains are achieved in the health sector compared to well-being gains you might get with similar investment of resources in a quite different sector. So you have that opportunity to have that very strategic discussion. Now, it doesn't mean that you reduce everything down to a benefit-cost ratio, but I think you have a platform for a more informed national dialogue about how you trade off these investments in different areas.
But I wondered if your question was bigger than that. I don't know. I mean, if you're talking about values, how do the values of a nation not only affect how we evaluate things, but they affect what we do? Did you have that in mind as well? Yes or no?
Yes, I do.
No, I mean, I think this is true. This is at a fairly elementary stage, this research, but John Halliwell, who did the analysis, the last one that Andrew Clark put up this morning, I mean, he's shown that, you know, the Scandinavian countries are happier because they have a more respectful attitude to each other, which leads to a high level of trust and so on. And of course, there's been a lot of research as between individuals and how important is it, you know, what's the happiness of somebody who cares a lot about earning a lot of money as opposed to having a lot of leisure, all those types of topics. It's absolutely clear that the absolute level of well-being as an outcome is affected, as Paul said earlier, by the preferences and norms of the nation. And that's a really important area of research. And I personally think that I totally agree with Paul's answer. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, the view that you could have a society where there were no social institutions that tried to influence how people behave and what they care about. There's never been such a society in human history. And that's the sort of libertarian rubbish, because how could, I mean, they have an ideology just like everybody else. It's impossible not to have an ideology. The values which we develop, especially through the school system, which is our most obvious tool, are going to be incredibly important to whether we can move away from that plateau of happiness that we seem to have been on for the last 50 years to a higher level or not.
Might I also add that the question, what are the optimal values of a society to have, is an incredibly tough one. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I would take a British specific type of phenomenon, you know, a stiff upper lip, which has been known to be British throughout centuries, would you want to get rid of that? And what would you replace it with? And what effects will that have throughout society? How would you get rid of it? I mean, I know nobody who can give you a good answer to any of that. I can pose the question, but it doesn't mean I have any inclination of even the answer to that. So far, we've sort of gone along with where the forces in our societies have led our values to go. And the notion that you can think more rationally about what kind of person would I like to be with what kind of values is fairly new still. It's sort of a self-designed question, which, yeah, it's a new area.
Hi, I'm Matt Lynch from the Department of Health. I just had a question about the philosophical underpinnings. And I'd like to kind of raise a challenge about whether there's any value in kind of justice or fairness or rights or freedoms beyond the effect on individual subjective well-being.
Well, as I said, I think we should think about social justice in terms of the distribution of well-being. So social justice means trying to prevent anybody having a low level of well-being. That's my interpretation of the aspiration for social justice. I think all rights are man-made, and they really only have a meaning if you embody them in law. But we should embody rights in law, as all kinds of barriers against people sinking into the low levels of well-being. So that would be my attitude to where rights come from. And I certainly wouldn't think there's any intrinsic value in freedom beyond the fact that it happens to be a really important contributing factor to well-being, freedom in many, many dimensions of choice in what you do with your life.
Well, I will answer that in a similar but slightly different way, which is that if I think about how to be the happiest society possible, so many difficulties arise because, you know, it's so hard to think of the interaction of 70 million people on one island and then with 6 billion others, that I quickly run out of mental space to think through the full ramification of any particular intervention. And so then you start to realize that our societies already have lots of rules of thumb into them as to what makes sense and what not, and freedoms and our legal establishment. and the ways in which we interact with each other have come about through thousands of years of interaction, and this is these are the surviving laws and norms which have been useful to somebody to put them in, and then they've not been too bad, so they've been kept in. And so from that perspective, the perspective we tried to give you earlier today is that you take the status quo and think whether you can improve things incrementally seems to make a lot of sense, right? And so I wouldn't want to, as it were, start from scratch and do away with all rights and all social norms and then in a utopian manner redesign a society. Nobody's that powerful and nobody could do it. And so our very mindset of trying to horse race different interventions from the existing status quo, effectively accepting the status quo is not so bad, right? Not requiring revolutionary change. It seems to me the situation that we have and that is sensible. And I'm presuming that, in fact, Martin, Richard, you're probably like-minded on that.
Yeah. I mean, of course, those of you who've done philosophy will remember the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism says that from the principle of maximizing well-being, you find out what rules should follow, and then you always follow them, even if you could possibly do a bit better by not following them sometimes. Act utilitarianism says you judge every action on its merits. Now, in practice, that approach is completely impossible. That's roughly what Paul has been saying. So we're all rule utilitarians of a sort. We would all say that you should tell the truth, you should keep a promise, you should do all these rules that human beings have lived by for many centuries, though sometimes you might have to divert in the interest of a greater good, but you should feel a huge imperative attaching to these rules. Oh, is everybody coming now? Is that what's going on? Is Jan with us?
There he is. Yep.
Jan, why don't you come and get yourself installed? And can somebody chase the others to come, if they're there, without anything else to do? Well, while Jan's getting himself organised, we have been talking so far, haven't we, of well-being as the ultimate outcome which matters. And I hope that that's how most of us think. But if we want to persuade other people to take well-being seriously who don't believe that, we can also make a huge case in terms of the fact that well-being has a very big positive impact on other things that they care about. To some extent, we've touched on that because some of that has an impact on cost. So we've been picking that up through its impact on cost. But I think Jan is going to talk about it as if the other outcomes are of intrinsic value themselves, and he's going to tell us how well-being is affecting these other things that people think to have intrinsic value.